My name is Geoff Abbott, and I have had a somewhat adventurous career, consisting as it did of 35 years in the Royal Air Force, trained as an engine fitter, working on Hurricanes, Spitfires, bombers, anything with a fan at the front I had to get serviceable, and then keep my fingers crossed and say a little prayer as it took off. I stayed in the Royal Air Force until 1974, finishing up as a warrant officer with NATO in Holland. And I was then privileged to be accepted as a yeoman warder at the Tower of London, member of the Queen's Bodyguard, Special Constable of the Met. Being a yeoman warder is a life appointment, and so, although no longer there, I'm still a yeoman warder, member of the Queen's Bodyguard, but not on the active list. I then left the Tower, in which of course we lived with our families and still do, and I moved to Kendal in Cumbria, and being a lover of tradition, I volunteered for the post of mace bearer to the Mayor of Kendal and subsequently sword bearer. A very traditional post, in particular sword bearer. Kendal's sword is 3 foot 11.5 inches long, and I had to lead the procession every year many times, and one has to be very careful as sword bearer not to turn round too quickly and kebab the mayor.
Geoff, why did you join the RAF?
I left school and at the age of 16 worked for Ferry Aviation Company. They were making single-engine battle bombers, and then I realised that I didn't want to spend my whole life in a factory, and so I joined the Royal Air Force on my 17th birthday, and a few days later, on the 3rd of September, war was declared. I was then under training as an engine fitter, and in 1942 I was posted to the Middle East. There we lived under canvas in the desert working on aircraft, and later, during the 4 years I spent in the Middle East during the war, I moved south to East Africa and Italian Somaliland, now Somalia, still working on Gladiator fighters, Hurricanes and Spitfires.
Can you tell me about the early part of your career as an aero engineer?
You would like to know about my first posting after training as an engine fitter, and that was to RAF Ringway, which is now very considerably altered, is now Manchester Airport. But in those days it was a little airfield in the country, and we were equipped with Whitley twin-engine bombers, which had been used in the early part of the war to drop leaflets over enemy territory in Germany, and had been modified in order that we could train parachute troops. A big hole in the bottom of the aircraft so the troops could drop down. And we flew every day and every night, training these young soldiers, 8 men at a time. It was called a stick, 8 soldiers. And we flew and dropped them at our DZ, the drop zone, at Tatton Park in Cheshire, just a few miles away. We flew at the low altitude of 300 feet. This was necessary, think about it, because when you're dropping single airmen, when they land, you want them to be packed as closely together to defend themselves and attack the enemy, not one here and another one a mile away. And so we dropped them from 300 feet. But that meant that there wasn't time to use the usual method of opening your parachute by pulling a ripcord after counting the hour of 10. If you had, you'd have hit the ground just as you got to the number 5. And so the airmen, the young soldiers, had a parachute on their front, and it was released by a long strap which was attached to the front of the parachute and the other end to a rail inside the aircraft. And as the man dropped out of the hole, he was swept backwards until the cover was ripped off. Occasionally I used to stand in the tail of the aircraft where the gun turret had been removed And as we flew over the drop Z, you would see the young man flying backwards, horror on his face, because the chute hadn't opened, right underneath the tail wheel there, hurtling backwards, and then another and another. And they all descended beneath me, opening up like a whole stream of white mushrooms. A fantastic display indeed. And we go round, return to base, pick up another 8, on, day and night. Unfortunately, hundreds of those young men were killed in the big parachute invasion at the Battle of Anzio and later in the war. But that was war.
And what was the pace of life like for you as an engineer? How busy were you at that time?
Every engine fitter was allocated his own aircraft. That was clever because that meant that you could listen to every cough and splutter of your engines and know how to rectify it. And you went on duty in the morning, you got your aircraft out of the hangar and you checked it all over, and then you had to sign a form, number 700, to say that the aircraft was fully serviceable, that it had sufficient petrol and oil. You then got in the aircraft and you opened the throttle and checked it to the fullest extent, with the noise absolutely catastrophic. But you had to ensure that that aircraft was 100% fit, because in a few minutes' time you were going to have to stand on the tarmac and watch that aircraft take off. And if you had not done your work properly or overlooked something, you could cause the instant death of one pilot or a pilot and a whole crew of 8 young soldiers in it. The aircraft was so old that the one I had would do only 90 miles an hour. But one day, my good friend Ronnie Hall, his aircraft did 95 miles an hour, and you couldn't speak to him for days afterwards. And so they would take off, and for night flying, you had to illuminate the airfield by what we call goosenecks. If you imagine a watering can with a long spout, and in the end you put wadding and fill the body of the watering can with paraffin and put them out at intervals along the airfield. That is a flare path, so the aircraft landing could see how to land, okay? One particular night I was on flare path duty and all our flares were out, and the call came through, enemy aircraft are approaching Manchester. And get those flares extinguished as quickly as you can, because you're illuminating the airfield for the enemy. And we had to get this truck out and drive up and down, and you could hear whum, 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 whum of aircraft overhead. We didn't know whether it was our aircraft returning or the Germans looking down and saying, "Oh, how hospitable of the English to tell us where to drop the bombs." Luckily, we got the last few out and got out of the way, and the bombs fell further on in the countryside. But that was life, and that servicing the aircraft every morning, and at night we had to service them ready for the night flying. So life was hectic, you just went on and on.